getting taxes down for everybody and taking care of the poor, but also expecting everybody to have some skin in the game, except the really poor, and help our country to pull out of the mess that we're in. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Healthcare, yes, I do. A second opinion. Senator, we're in a quorum call.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor as I have week after week since the health care bill was signed into law with a doctor's second opinion about the health care law, because the President repeatedly made promises to the American people as the health care bill was being debated and even after the health care law was signed. And he promised to improve, not hurt, the quality of medical care in this country. We now know that the President's health care law actually makes the problems of health care in this country worse. In fact, since this bill was signed into law, we've learned that it makes the cost of health care worse. We know that it makes Americans' ability to get health care worse, and the ability of individuals to keep the care that they like makes their ability to keep that care worse. So, Mr. President, today I'd like to first talk about the cost of care. And President Obama promised the American families that they would see their health insurance premiums go down because of the health care law. And he actually told that they would go down by over $2,000 per family. Well, now we know that that's just not the case. In fact, Americans have seen their premiums increase 19% since the time that the President signed his health care bill into law. And just looking at the front page of the Sheridan Press, Sheridan, Wyoming, yesterday, headline front page, health care premium increase. County administrative director said the county's cost to provide health care coverage for employees will increase by about $360,000 this year. We're talking about one county, 1 out of 23 counties in Wyoming, $360,000 for county employees. You know, throughout this entire health care debate, the President promised the American people that if they liked their health care plan, that his health care law would let them keep it. Another broken promise. Employers all across the country have made it clear that the health care law's mandates are too expensive and threaten their ability to offer insurance to their employees. A recent study by McKinsey & Company, which is a reputable national consulting firm, produced the report titled, How U.S. Health Care Reform Will Affect Employees' Benefits. They surveyed over 1,300 employers across diverse industries, geographies, and employer sizes. The results confirm what Republicans and American workers and their families knew all along, and they knew it long before the President and Washington Democrats forced this health care law down their throats. Overall, the report says 30% of employers will definitely or probably stop offering employer-sponsored coverage in the years after 2014, when the Obama health care law goes fully into effect. Among employers with a high awareness of the health care reform law and what's specifically in the law, well, then the proportion of those who will definitely or probably stop offering coverage jumps to 50%, and upward of 60% will pursue other options. Well, so at least 30% of employers would actually gain economically from dropping coverage, even if they completely compensated their employees for the change through other benefit offerings and higher salaries. Apparently, the President's promise of if you like the health insurance you have today, you can keep it, translates into you may very well lose your coverage. Now, as former Congressional Budget Office Director Doug Holtz-Eakin's analysis confirms, if employers decided to drop coverage, which is actually in their economic best interest to do in many cases based on their economic evaluation, the cost of federal insurance subsidies will skyrocket. Remember, the White House and Democrats in Congress met behind closed doors. They acted swiftly and covertly to pass a law without regard for how its provisions would impact each and every American family. Then the question is, will Americans actually have the ability to get medical care they need from a doctor they want at a price they can afford? The President promised that his law would increase access to affordable care. Some groups tell a different story. In April of 2010, a month after the President signed his health care plan into law, the Association of American Medical Colleges estimated that based on graduation and training rates, this country would have a shortage of 150,000 doctors over the next 15 years. In May of the same year, the American Medical Association issued the results of its survey showing the impact of low payment rates and the threat of future payment cuts on Medicare patients' access to care. The AMA found that 1 in 5 physicians currently restrict the number of Medicare patients they see. The AMA study showed that nearly a third of primary care physicians restrict the number of Medicare patients that they take into their practice. And all any of the members of the Senate need to do is, at home on the weekend, talk to someone in your community, someone who's on Medicare, someone who's trying to find a doctor to care for them, and see how very difficult it is for someone on Medicare age to find a doctor to care for them. Well, later last year, the Association of American Medical Colleges related updated physician shortage estimates. The September 2010 study said that by 2015, doctor shortages are actually 50% worse than originally projected. By 2020, there'll be a shortage of 45,000 primary care physicians and a shortage of 46,000 surgeons and medical specialists. So I find it ironic that we have a health care law that's passed that actually doesn't put money into training doctors to treat you, but puts money in to hire IRS agents to investigate you. Absolutely astonishing. These studies clearly demonstrate that the President's health care law will only make it harder for Americans to see their doctors. In fact, Washington only expanded the ability of folks to get government-approved, government-mandated, government-subsidized coverage. They did not expand the ability of the American people to actually get medical care. And there is a huge difference between medical coverage and medical care. When you take over $500 billion away from our seniors on Medicare, not to save Medicare, but to start a brand new government program for someone else, well, that's a way to make the problem worse. When you force 16 million more people onto Medicaid, a program where half of the doctors in the country won't see those patients, that also makes the problem worse. And the front page of yesterday's USA Today, yesterday, Mr. President, Wednesday, July 6th, the headline, Medicaid payments go under the knife. State cuts could add to shortage of doctors. Second paragraph, some health care experts say the cuts, most of which went into effect July 1st or will later this month, could add to a shortage of physicians and other providers participating in Medicaid. The article goes on to say that under the health care law, more than 16 million additional people will become eligible starting in 2014. So already we have a situation where doctors are reluctant to take care of people on Medicaid, and yet the President's solution to the health care dilemmas in this country are to put more people into a system that is already broken. Well, Mr. President, we're giving individuals and families an insurance card, but not really giving them access to the care that has been promised. And adults aren't the only ones who are in waiting lines to get into a doctor's office as the lines get longer. In fact, children enrolled in Medicaid have a much harder time accessing medical care than children who have private insurance. Yet that's the President's solution to the needs of this country. January 16th of this year, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study conducted in Cook County, Illinois. It's President Obama's hometown of Chicago. People were calling medical offices asking for appointments. They were asking for appointments for children with chronic conditions or acute conditions, and telling the offices, these were kind of secret shoppers, telling the office that the person had Medicaid or had private insurance. But what they found is that 66% of the time, when the researcher called for an appointment and they mentioned Medicaid, they were denied an appointment. But only 11% of the researchers calling for appointments who said they had private insurance, only 11% would not get an appointment. So there you have 66% denied if they have Medicaid, only 11% denied with private insurance. And those Medicaid patients who did get an appointment, well, they faced wait times twice as long as kids with private insurance, an average of about 6 weeks. Well, as one caller was told when asked what kind of insurance the person had, when that person said Medicaid, the receptionist at the medical office said, Medicaid is not insurance. Yet that is what the President and the Democrats base their entire health care plan on, $16 million more onto Medicaid. So, Mr. President, here it is, over a year after the law has been signed, the President's health care law has made health care in America worse. Premiums are higher. The lines at the doctor's office are longer. It is more difficult to get a doctor to care for you. This isn't what the President's health care law was supposed to do, and it's not what the President promised the American people last year. He promised that the health care law would make health care in America better for all Americans. But each week we learn that the promises are coming up empty and that health care in America under this health care law has been made worse. And that's why week after week I come to the Senate floor as we learn more things about the Senate, about the health care law that passed the Senate, passed the House, was signed by the President, and in my opinion, as a doctor who practiced medicine for 24 years, has actually been bad for patients, bad for providers, the nurses and doctors who take care of those patients, and bad for the taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And I have two things I want to talk about, but I first want to deal with the resolution that we have on the floor that we had a vote today, which was this motion to proceed to Senate 1323, a bill to express the sense of the Senate on shared sacrifice in resolving the budget. And I think it's important that we realize what's in this sense of the Senate. The findings that the Congress makes here are very important. And I'd just like to read these three findings. The Wall Street Journal reports that the median pay for chief financial officers of the S&P 500 companies increased 19% to $2.9 billion last year. And then you compare that with the middle class. Over the last 10 years, the median family income has declined by more than $2,500. 20% of all income earned in the United States is earned by the top 1% of individuals. Over the past quarter century, 4/5 of the income gains accrued to the top 1% of individuals. And so we conclude in this sense of the Senate, it's the sense of the Senate that any agreement to reduce the budget deficit should require that those earning $1 million or more per year make a more meaningful contribution to the deficit reduction effort. And that's what we've been talking about today. That's what our leaders are doing, meeting at the White House with the President, is trying to come up with a budget deal and a resolution to this that involves shared sacrifice and involves putting us on a path to better budget responsibility, reducing the national budget deficit. And clearly part of this has to do with millionaires paying more of their fair share. Now, we got 74 votes on the motion to proceed, but I heard many people say, many senators walk to the floor and say, well, I'm voting for the motion to proceed and vote cloture on the motion to proceed, but I'm not sure I support the bill. But at least the 74 votes, I think, shows a little bit of bipartisanship in terms of a mix of revenue and expenditure cuts. And that's the point I wanted to make on this resolution. First of all, I hear things from the White House that worry me because what has been said when we talk about a package, and they're talking about the overall package, is they say we're going to have a ratio of 1 to 3, meaning 75% cuts and only 25% revenue. So 3/4 cuts, 1/4% revenue. Now, how does that compare how we got out of deficit situations in the past? I think that's one of the most important things to look at here, because we were in a big hole in the 1980s. The Reagan administration had taken us down that road, and President Clinton and President Bush 41 had to deal with that situation. And what did they come up with? They came up with an agreement which was basically 55% revenue and 45% cuts. So it was about a 50-50 situation. And I would just urge the President to look at the budget. We've only been briefed in a very cursory way that Kent Conrad has prepared, but it comes in at about 50-50 in terms of revenue and cuts. We have to realize we're at the lowest federal revenue we've seen in 60 years and the highest federal expenditures we've seen in 60 years. So you have to work at both sides of this. And that's where I hope the President really comes in with some kind of proposal as he's negotiating this, and I really look forward to him doing that. The other topic I wanted to talk about here is, and I'd like this place to ask consent to place this at another point in the record.
Without objection.
This topic is wildfires in New Mexico. I spent the last week in my state of New Mexico. I stayed there. I started to go to the plane, and I kept hearing the reports from my staff, and one of the most shocking was the entire community of Los Alamos. 12,000 people were evacuated because a forest fire was coming in their direction. And as I kept getting the reports and the evacuations starting to take place, I thought, well, the best thing to do is to not fly out, to go back to the community of Los Alamos and the surrounding communities and try to assist in any way I could. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and I think there are some lessons to be learned in terms of budgets and deficits and how we should invest. But I'd first like to thank the senators who helped me while I was gone. As the presiding officer, Senator Franken knows, we are assigned weekly duties in terms of presiding. And I was supposed to preside last week, and 3 senators, Senator Durbin, Senator Merkley, and my cousin Mark Udall, stepped up to help me with presiding time. I had an amendment that was on the floor when we were dealing with the rules package. And Senator Harkin helped me with that proposal. So there was a real team effort within our Democratic caucus to help me to be able to work on the wildfire issue out in New Mexico and be able to stay there and have my capable staff and the other senators that help out. And I just want to thank everybody for that team effort. Now, the wildfires that are raging across New Mexico are not only in New Mexico. A number of states have been hit: Texas, Arizona, Florida, and my home state of New Mexico. Generally, what we see in this country is the fire season starts at the southern part and moves up to the north as we go through the summer season. And in the Southwest, we have had an extraordinary fire season. I was just briefed by Secretary Vilsack when I was out there. He talked in the Southwest region about 1,600-plus fires burning 1.5 million acres. And this is still very early in the fire season. We could see a lot more burning going on. And then the thing that really hit me was the fact that we were told this is the driest recorded summer since the Forest Service has been keeping records. So pretty remarkable that we're in this kind of situation where we have a drought, we have fires that heat up. This particular fire for New Mexico, the name of it is called the Los Conchas Fire, right near Los Alamos. As we speak, it's more than 135,000 acres. It's almost three times as big as the previous fire situation that we've seen. And what happens with these forest fires in our dry, arid region is that we get extreme heat within the forest, and you get what are called crown fires, where the tops of the trees, these trees may be 30 to 50 to 100 feet tall, and the fires burn in the top of the crown. And they can spread when there's a 40 or 50 mile an hour wind, as there was in some cases here. They can be in the crown of the trees, and they can jump out a mile in advance with embers and creating additional fire in front of it. And as a result of the heat, very intensive heat, I think close to 1,000 degrees when you're right in the heat of the fire, it makes the soil so the soil won't absorb water any longer. Which is something that creates a situation when we get our rainy season, which occurs right after the fire season. You can have a serious flood situation. So that soil won't absorb water, so when the rains come, all of the soil on the surface washes off. It washes into reservoirs. It can fill them up with silt. Some of those are used for recreation, for fishing. Others are used for drinking water. For example, several of the communities in northern New Mexico get 40%, 50% of their water from drinking water from these reservoirs. So these kinds of forest fires can be absolutely devastating to communities. But the one thing we were thankful for because of the federal firefighters is the worst-case scenarios didn't occur. One of the things that was expected, and I think many saw this covered on the national media, is this might get into the national laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory, that there was going to be radiation released and those kinds of things. And in fact, we dodged a bullet there. It didn't go into Los Alamos National Laboratory. The labs and the residences were protected. There was another fire burning nearby that threatened the Santa Fe watershed. The fire changed directions, and because of the skillful firefighting, it didn't get into the watershed. So we dodged a bullet, but many other areas were severely impacted, and many other groups were. For example, New Mexico's Indian pueblos. We have 19 pueblos in New Mexico. Some of them were terribly impacted by this. The Nambe Pueblo, the Santa Clara Pueblo, San Ildefonso, the Jemez Pueblo, Oque-Awenge, and many other pueblos. And one of the most damaged pueblos was the Santa Clara Pueblo, and the governor of that pueblo is a gentleman by the name of Walter Daschino. And he and some of his counselors had come to a meeting. In the last two big fires, 85% of this Indian reservation has been burned. What they said when we were sitting in a room, and these are the elders from the Pueblo came to talk to us, they said, you know, our hearts are in a very sad state. The fire devastated our religious sites, our sacred sites. We had medicinal plants we would collect in this area. We can't do that any longer. And with great emotion, these elders said, we are never going to see this forest in the same condition again. And so obviously, the loss was great at Santa Clara, but it was all across. It was all across New Mexico of those pueblos that I just named, and it's a very, very significant loss. And the first thing I want to do in speaking today is to thank all the firefighters that were involved in this effort. We have, I think, fighting just this one fire, 2,600 firefighters from all over the nation. 15 different states put firefighters in to do this. It's incredibly tough work, difficult, tough, dirty work. I met many of these firefighters out on the front where they were fighting the fires. Some of them would talk about how they'd been away from their families for 2 weeks, hadn't had a shower, sleeping in tents, tremendously trying occupation, being a firefighter, but they believe in it, they show up every day, and they do an incredible job. And they were supported by our National Guard, who guarded the community of Los Alamos while the people were evacuated to make sure there wasn't any crime going on. The state police patrolled the roads to try to make sure that they could keep order. Local law enforcement, local firefighters participated, the local fire departments. So it was an incredible effort by our community pulling together. And one of the most remarkable things is the expertise at the federal level in federal land management agencies of firefighters. These teams are headed up. Typically, you'll have a Type 1 and a Type 2 team, and the head of the team, called the incident commander, will probably have 20, 25, 30 years of experience in fighting fires every summer around the country. These are career people from the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Park Service, and a variety of other federal agencies that really step up to the plate and help out when we get in these emergency situations. And as I said, they come from all over the country to work in the states that are impacted, and then as the fire season spreads north up to Colorado and Wyoming and Montana, those same firefighters move on up to continue the battle up there. And one of the points that I take from this, one of the things I learned from this, and President Lincoln, I think, said this very well, government does for people what they can't do for themselves. Collectively, we pull together when we hit situations where if you have an individual who has a home in Los Alamos, there's not much he can do with a big forest fire coming in the direction. But we can organize as a governmental entity to say when we get big catastrophic fires like this that we're going to have people that are competent, that are capable, and that have all of this experience in fighting fires that will come together and help out. And that's something that we need to protect. When we think of debating budgets and deficits and all of that, there's a very, very important function that government serves out there, and we need to protect that safety net function, that collective function where we help each other. And this firefighting, I think, is a great example of where government is needed, and we could be devastated if we didn't have the expertise that the government has in terms of fighting fires. Now, the other thing I saw at these fires, and it was pretty remarkable. And it's when I've been to tornado sites in New Mexico, when I've been to some of the flood situations, the thing that stands out to me is how New Mexicans pulled together in this situation. New Mexicans helping New Mexicans. The pueblos that I talked about that were so impacted by the fires, they actually opened up other sites on their reservations so that the evacuees that were coming out of Los Alamos, the 12,000 people, several of these pueblos said, you know, we're going to open up our convention center and let them set up cots, and we're going to feed the people. We're going to do everything we can to help with this situation. At the same time, their particular pueblo was being devastated by a forest fire. So there was an extraordinary outpouring of goodwill that New Mexicans have shown in this kind of emergency situation. And what the remarkable thing to see is in a time of need, people pulling together and doing that in such a way that it really brings tears to your eyes. There was one individual I just want to talk about. This is an individual I was in talking to a group of people that were training for a charity that was going to help the evacuees, help them serve meals, help them set up cots, help them be organized. And I got a question from the floor, and the individual said to me, they said, you know, I lived in Los Alamos, and I had to come down here. I'm an evacuee, but I found a friend that was able to put me up, and I know there are other people that don't have that situation. And so I'm out here today training with the American Red Cross because I want to help the others, and I want to try to give back. I mean, that's the spirit that we saw in New Mexico of even if you were in need and been driven from your home, you were still trying to help out, and I think it's a pretty remarkable story. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to do as we look across the country and we see floods in the Midwest and wildfires in the Southwest and tornadoes, all of these things require a disaster relief bill. They require disaster relief funding for agencies who deal with fires and all these other natural disasters. And these things are very costly for local government. FEMA steps in and helps out with the governor making a request. The Forest Service helps out. There are burn area rehabilitation teams that move in right after a fire to try to protect the erosion and so there aren't bad floods. And we've got to try to do everything we can to make sure we maintain, once again in this deficit situation that we're in, that kind of responsibility. The federal government has to help. The federal government has to help in deficit. Even within a deficit situation, we have to have a disaster relief kind of effort. And the idea that we are going to somehow change the way we do disasters now, that we're going to take money away from Medicaid in order to put it into disasters is I don't think a very good idea. And so I think when we talk about how we do disaster relief, we need to remember that we're all in this together, and when we hit disasters, we need to help each other. And to show you the kind of pressure that we're under in New Mexico, Secretary Vilsack with the Forest Service was out in New Mexico, and the one plea he made to the congressional delegation, because we were talking to him about watersheds that mean clean drinking water in that kind of situation, and the Secretary said, you know, I've got a program. It's called the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. It's for all over the country. It's when we get in these kind of wildfire, flood, whatever the situation is. He says we have $9 million in the account. He says already before your requests or any others have come in from New Mexico and other states. He says, I know there are fires down in Florida and fires in Texas and Arizona. He says we have $45 million in requests. So $9 million in the account, $45 million in requests. And what we're talking about when we talk about watersheds is drinking water not deteriorating and that kind of thing. So we need to remember that there's a lot the federal government does in a shared way with local communities to protect those communities. And just my final note, to talk a little bit about the biggest picture here, and that's about climate change and global warming. We're seeing these wildfires, droughts, and floods like we've never seen before. I've seen senators from all over the country talking about these disaster situations. And the scientists tell us that we're putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We're warming the atmosphere. In the West, what the scientists tell us, it's going to be twice as hot in the West, the computer models show, than in other places in the country. And while the climate scientists are very cautious with their modeling and what they say, you know, you can't point to any particular storm. I can't say that that particular fire that occurred in New Mexico, the Las Conchas fire, said that fire was caused by global warming or climate change. They also tell us, and this is the part we really need to listen to, the scientists tell us what we are going to see as a result of this is more severe weather events, meaning more severe. So if you get into a drought situation, it's going to be a more severe drought, which is exactly what we're seeing in New Mexico right now. When you get floods, you're going to see a more severe flood. You're going to see more severe wildfires. These are all the things that we're seeing today in New Mexico. We're seeing them across the nation. And we've seen extreme floods in New Mexico, catastrophic forest fires. We're seeing droughts we haven't seen before. The Forest Service has been keeping records for 117 years. And they just reported to us that there is no record for how dry we are right now. This is the driest year we've ever had, which laid the groundwork for the wildfires we had with the wind and all the other things that occurred. So we can't put our heads in the sand in terms of climate change, in terms of global warming. We have to look at these things and realize that we're contributing to them. And we need to put policies in place, solid policies that put us on a path to reducing that carbon dioxide pollution that is out there. So with that, Mr. President, I thank you very much and thank the Senate for the time, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I stand before you today to discuss a problem that's of concern to 300 million Americans. It relates to our national debt, a debt that will soon cross the $15 trillion threshold. We've been asked to raise the debt limit, extend the nation's credit one more time. This we have the power to do, but we have to ask ourselves the question, should we exercise that power? Should we incur additional debt yet again without any plan moving forward to change fundamentally the way that we spend money in Washington, D.C.? Our current law requiring us to raise the debt limit periodically every time our existing line of credit dries up dates back to 1982. We've raised the debt limit since 1982 nearly 40 times. I fear that if we do it again this time without any permanent binding plan in place, legal restrictions, changing the way that Congress spends money, that we'll be right back to the same trough just a few months later. That's a problem, because as we do this over time, we inevitably put pressure on our financial system, pressure that will soon cause our economy dire circumstances, pressure that will in time result in excessive job losses, skyrocketing interest rates, and lots of other economic conditions that would be, to say the least, unpleasant. It's for this reason that 100 senators from around the country have canceled their plans that they had previously made to spend time with their constituents in their respective home states this week. That had been our plan, to spend time in our home states. We canceled those plans so that we could come back here and have serious, earnest debate and discussion surrounding the best path forward toward moving in the direction of a balanced budget, toward figuring out what conditions, if any, would satisfy the American people who are understandably concerned about the prospect of yet another knee-jerk reflexive debt limit increase. The American people understand the fact that if we choose to do nothing more than say, well, if we're going to raise the debt limit by $2 trillion, let's make sure that we cut $2 trillion from our anticipated spending. They understand that that kind of promise is one that isn't binding on the Congress if those spending cuts are stretched out over the course of 10 or 15 years or more, as has been discussed. Because we here in this Congress cannot bind the Congress that will be sworn into power in January of 2013 or January of 2015 or January of 2017. We can't bind a future Congress. We can make suggestions that they can follow, but we can't bind them. Unless, of course, we choose to do that which has been done only 27 times in our nation's history, which is amend the Constitution. That will bind a future Congress. That, I believe, is what we have to do in order to change fundamentally the way we spend money in Washington, to make sure that we're not headed back to the same trough just a few months from now to do exactly the same thing, leading us closer and closer to the dire circumstances that I described a few minutes ago. While we've been here this week, convening during the week that was previously scheduled for a recess, we as a group of Senate Republicans have come together and offered a real meaningful solution. We have offered to raise the debt limit, introduced legislation today with 21 Republican co-sponsors in the Senate, in a piece of legislation that we're calling the Cut, Cap, Balance Act. And here's what it says. It says we'll raise the debt limit. We'll do so only under 3 circumstances, only after 3 very specific conditions precedent have been met. The first 2 relate to immediate spending cuts to discretionary spending and statutory spending caps, making sure that we start putting ourselves right now on a statutorily mandated glide path toward a balanced budget. The third step, which is by far the most important, involves the passage out of both houses of Congress by the requisite 2/3 margin, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, one that would cap spending as a percentage of GDP and one that would require a 2/3 supermajority in order to raise taxes. Upon each of those conditions being met, then the debt limit would raise. But only then. We would not raise it without those conditions having been met. Because if we don't meet those conditions, we won't be able to look our constituents in the eye and say, we've done what needs to be done in order to make sure that we get to where we need to be, in order to get to the point at which we will no longer be in a position of having to go back to the same trough every few months to go through the ceremony of raising the debt limit yet again. We have to remember that every time we do this, we run an increased risk that we'll start having to pay higher and higher yields on our Treasury instruments. Every time that happens, we incur more expenses that relate to our ability to remain current on our debt interest payments. Every time interest rates, yields on those debt instruments go up by 1 percentage point, we have to spend an additional $150 billion a year just in interest once our debt instruments catch up with the increased rate. That's a lot of money. That means that if we were just to return, let's say if interest rates were to go up 3%, we could soon find ourselves in a position in which we might be spending as much as $700 billion a year on interest. We're currently paying about $250 billion. $700 billion a year is roughly what we spend on national defense. It's roughly what we spend on Social Security in an entire year. It's close to what we pay in Medicare and Medicaid combined at the federal level in an entire year. So where's the difference going to come from when interest rates start to creep up? Even if they go up 3 percentage points, they'd still be below their historical average. That money has to come from somewhere, and it will. It'll end up coming from the various programs that Americans are most concerned about. So whether you're a conservative and you might be most concerned about that money coming from our defense budget, or on the other hand, if you're a liberal and perhaps you're most concerned about it coming from entitlements, you ought to be concerned about our practice of perpetually raising the debt limit and engaging in perpetual deficit spending, especially when that deficit spending is now in excess of $1.5 trillion every single year. This potentially threatens every federal program out there. It also interferes with the ability of each American to find the prosperity that he or she seeks, the ability of each American to live his or her life in the way that he or she chooses. That's distressing. It interferes with the liberty of the individual, which is what we've been elected to protect. I'm very proud to be part of this 21-senator coalition, a group consisting of senators who are concerned enough about this issue that they're willing to say, we understand that we can't just not raise the debt limit. There are enough people who are concerned enough in this country about not raising it, the abrupt halt in spending that would bring about would create enough uncertainty and chaos that many are unwilling to face that prospect. So recognizing that reality, we've taken the bull by the horns and we're willing to do a difficult thing. But we're saying in order for us to raise the debt limit, we have to be willing to set things in motion in such a way that will solve the underlying problem, will create permanent structural spending reform within the United States Congress. I want to close by responding to an argument made recently by Timothy Geithner, the Secretary of the United States Treasury. The argument he made was to the effect that we in Congress are essentially mere surplus when it comes to the debt limit increase. He made the argument that, as I understand it, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment somehow independently authorizes the executive branch, perhaps the Treasury Secretary, perhaps just the President, to somehow raise the debt limit without consulting Congress, without an act of Congress in place. That argument is not accurate. That argument is based on an improper reading of the 14th Amendment. The language to which he refers reads in pertinent part as follows. The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, shall not be questioned. Adopted in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, this provision simply acknowledges the fact that we can't ignore our debt obligations, that when interest or principal come due on our national debt, those things have to be honored. You notice that in the middle of it, set off by commas, is a phrase that says authorized by law. To create law in this country, you have to move something through Congress. That something has to be presented to the President for signature or veto. You can't make a law in the United States government without Congress. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 makes that point clear by giving the authority to Congress to incur debt in the name of the United States. So necessarily, by definition, by operation of the plain text of the Constitution, you cannot raise the debt limit without an act of Congress. If anything, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment simply makes clear that which I wish Secretary Geithner would acknowledge, and I hereby call upon him to acknowledge, which is that he has a legal and a moral obligation to make sure that if the debt limit is not increased, during whatever time that it remains in limbo, during whatever time that we face a debt limit-induced shortfall, it is his obligation as the Secretary of the Treasury to use the first tax revenues coming in the door to pay our debt obligations, to pay the interest that's being accrued on our national debt. It's his obligation not only as a fiduciary or quasi-fiduciary, but also under the very provision of the Constitution. Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, the same provision that he cites, binds his hands and requires him to make sure that that interest gets paid, prohibits him from bringing about a default on our national debt, which is what he's been threatening on many occasions. There is a way forward, The circumstances in which we now find ourselves are, to be sure, threatening. They are intimidating, they are daunting, and they are circumstances that bring about a substantial amount of disagreement within this body and within the body that meets just down the hall from us. But there are answers, there are solutions to which we can agree. I believe that the Cut, Cap, Balance Act provides the proper solution, and it's a solution that can appeal to liberals and conservatives alike, to Democrats and Republicans alike. And I call on all within the sound of my voice to take a careful look at this legislation, to jump on board and become part of the solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. Senator from Rhode Island. Mr. President, I rise to speak today about a serious public health issue in my home state of Rhode Island and to commend the Environmental Protection Agency for its actions to address it. Rhode Island has the 6th highest rate of asthma in the country. According to our Department of Health, more than 25,000 Rhode Island children, or 11% of children in our state, more than 1 in every 10 kids, suffers from asthma. 82,000 adults in Rhode Island, which is also about 11% of our adult population, suffers also from this chronic disease. From 2005 to 2009, asthma was the underlying cause or a contributing cause of death for 240 people in Rhode Island, including 4 children. In 2009, there were 1,750 hospital discharges in Rhode Island for asthma cases. Those hospital stays cost about $8 million in just that 1 year in direct medical costs, not counting the costs associated with days of work and school missed or the medication for ongoing treatment. On a clear summer day in Rhode Island, many of us have had the experience commuting into work of hearing the warning on drive time radio. Today is a bad air day in Rhode Island. Infants, senior citizens, and people with respiratory difficulties should stay indoors today. In fact, yesterday was just such a day in Rhode Island. An air quality alert was issued by our State Department of Environmental Management, warning that ozone was expected to reach dangerous levels in the southern half of our state by afternoon. They recommended that all residents limit physical exertion and take refuge in air-conditioned environments for the better part of the day. In addition, Rhode Island's public transit operator, RIPTA, the Rhode Island Public Transit Agency, offered free bus rides all day long to help keep people out of their cars. These are real costs, costs paid in freedom, in reduced quality of life, in medical bills, in burdened public services to respond to the health risks of dirty air, and in more missed days of work and school. There is still a lot to learn, Mr. President, about the causes and cures of asthma, but we know that air pollution triggers asthma attacks. And we know that air pollution is a preventable problem. Armed with this knowledge, Rhode Island has taken great strides to reduce air pollution. In 2006, Rhode Island passed a law to prohibit cars and buses from idling with their engines on. In 2007, Rhode Island passed a law to retrofit all state school buses with diesel pollution controls. In 2010, Rhode Island began requiring heavy-duty vehicles used in federally funded construction projects to install diesel pollution controls, to adhere to the state anti-idling law, and to use only low-sulfur diesel fuel. RIPTA has voluntarily retrofitted half of its bus fleet with diesel pollution control equipment. However, Rhode Island cannot solve its air pollution problem on its own. We could stop driving entirely and shut down every industry in our state, and we would still have problems with ground-level ozone and particulate matter pollution. Why is that? It's because, as EPA has determined, most of the pollution that lands in Rhode Island is sent to us by other states. And much of that out-of-state pollution comes from virtually uncontrolled Midwestern coal-fired power plants that are tied to excessively tall smokestacks that send pollution hundreds of miles away from the source. Last month, at my request, the Government Accountability Office completed a report about tall smokestacks at coal power plants. Here's what the report said. In 1970, the year the Clean Air Act was enacted, there were 2 tall stacks over 500 feet in the United States. By 1985, this number of tall stacks had grown from 2 to more than 180. Utilities and industry literally built their way into compliance with the Clean Air Act. And the trend continued. As of December 31, 2010, the end of last year, 284 tall stacks were operating at 172 coal power plants in the United States. These tall smokestacks are associated with 64% of the coal generating capacity in our country. Most of the coal generating capacity in our country vents its pollution through tall smokestacks. Most of the tall stacks, 207 of them, nearly 3/4 of them, are between 500 and 699 feet tall. 63 of them are between 700 and 999 feet tall. And the remaining 14 are over 1,000 feet tall. The tallest stack at a coal power plant in the United States, at 1,038 feet, is at the Rockport Power Plant in Indiana. This graphic compares some of these stacks with some of the well-known landmarks in our country. The Statue of Liberty at 305 feet, the Washington Monument at 555 feet, stacks at 1,000 feet, 1,038, and 1,204 feet, the Empire State Building in New York, and the Willis Tower in Chicago. As I've noted in previous floor remarks on this subject, once a stack gets over 1,000 feet, it actually has to be marked on aviation maps as a hazard to avoid plane collisions. So what do I mean when I say that utilities built their way into compliance with these tall stacks? Well, in the early days of the Clean Air Act, some states allowed pollution sources to build tall stacks instead of installing pollution controls. The concept was that pollution sent high enough up in the atmosphere would be sent far away from the source and would not contribute to air pollution problems in that state, and everybody would be happy. Well, the problem is that this air pollution causes problems downwind in other states. As the GAO report put it, tall stacks generally disperse pollutants over greater distances than shorter stacks and provide pollutants greater time to react in the atmosphere to form ozone and particulate matter, which are the precursors to asthma. And yet, public health policy has not yet caught up with this practice, and Rhode Island pays the price. Making matters worse, the GAO found that more than half of the boilers attached to these tall stacks at the coal power plants have no scrubber to control sulfur dioxide emissions. None. Approximately 85% of these boilers went into service before 1980. So they're antiquated, and they're dirty, and they run the pollution up the tall stack, and it ends up being dumped on Rhode Island instead of cleaned up at the source. Nearly 2/3 of boilers connected to these tall stacks have no post-combustion controls for nitrogen oxide, controls that are vastly more effective than so-called low-NOx burners. Again, uncontrolled at the source. They dump the pollution up the tall stacks. They export it elsewhere. It is not their problem, and it then lands on Rhode Island. Here is a graphic that shows more than 70 coal plants which have tall stacks at boilers that operate without scrubbers or post-combustion nitrogen oxide controls. These boilers are sending hundreds of thousands of tons of unabated pollution up very tall smokestacks into the jet stream, and then the jet stream delivers it downwind onto states like Rhode Island. As the GAO indicated, in the mid-Atlantic United States, the wind generally blows from west to east during the day. Ozone can travel hundreds of miles at night with the help of high-speed winds known as the low-level jet. This phenomenon typically occurs at night due to the ground cooling quicker than the upper atmosphere, which can allow the low-level jet to form and transport ozone and particulate matter with its high winds. The map shows a typical prevailing wind pattern in the spring. Notice how the prevailing winds send so much of this pollution up and over to Rhode Island and to other states along the eastern seaboard. In fact, 5 of the states along this map, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, and North Carolina, have been identified by EPA as contributing significantly to Rhode Island's pollution problems. The electricity that comes from these uncontrolled power plants, which don't stop the pollution at the start, but instead jet it up into this low-level jet so that it gets dumped in other states, the electricity that comes from them might seem cheaper to consumers than electricity from a pollution-controlled power plant. But that's really not so. That would be wrong to consider or to conclude. The costs weren't cheaper. The costs just got shifted. They got shifted from the companies and the consumers in the polluting states to the lungs of children in Rhode Island and other downwind states. It is the lungs of children and adults and seniors in Rhode Island that are actually paying for that cheap electricity. Happily, Mr. President, and at last, the EPA has begun to remedy this unfair and wrongful public health situation by requiring utilities in upwind states to control their pollution under the Good Neighbor provision of the Clean Air Act. Because while a tall stack will send uncontrolled pollution farther than a short stack would, the most effective way to reduce pollution is to install pollution controls. Prompted by petitions from our downwind states, the Bush EPA attempted to set pollution limits for states to contribute to unhealthy pollution levels outside their borders. However, on review, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals told them that they had not gone far enough. So the EPA went back to the drawing board and crafted the cross-state air pollution rule that has been announced today, which will cap the pollution that can be produced in upwind states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, and North Carolina. Those caps were designed based on each state's contribution to pollution in states like Rhode Island, and it will ratchet down whenever EPA tightens air quality standards based on the latest and best science. As I said, that rule was finalized today, so thank you, EPA. I commend the EPA for finalizing that cross-state air pollution rule. I also urge EPA to update the National Ozone Air Quality Standard based on the recommendations from the CASAC, the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee. This will lead to further pollution reductions in states upwind of Rhode Island and further benefit for Rhode Islanders. These rules will bring us closer to the day when the coal power plants on this chart start taking responsibility for their pollution and stop exporting that pollution into Rhode Island and other states. When they install pollution control equipment rather than sending their pollution to where it becomes someone else's problem, and to when Rhode Island children can play outdoors safely without the risk of an asthma attack. I'm looking forward to that day, and I know the people of Rhode Island are too. When you drive in and that morning radio tells you that today is another bad air day and that children and seniors should stay indoors and can't play, can't take a walk, can't engage in anything that has exertion, it's frustrating when there's nothing that you can do about it. The Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management could pass regulations until it was blue in the face. The Rhode Island General Assembly could write new laws all day long, and it would make no difference because the bombardment of outside pollution on our state is what is driving these health problems. That's why EPA is so important. We would have no voice in this if it were not for a National Environmental Protection Agency that can look out for small states like ours that are on the receiving end of this kind of a pollution dump from the coal-fired, uncontrolled plants in the Midwest. So I thank very much the presiding officer, and I yield the floor. The absence of quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.